Good morning. This morning we're going to continue our lesson from Wednesday, which is dealing with identifying instructional and study strategies that improve memory retention among students. And today your inductive activity or your set induction is you're going to review a very short video, it's less than 3 minutes, on short-term working memory. And after we take a look at the video, we're going to have a discussion in regards to the different or the various parts of the brain that are involved in the memory making process. So as we take a look at the video, you're going to need to take some notes. So at this time, go ahead and get out your worksheets that I gave you on Wednesday that you're working with, because you're going to use that same worksheet to take notes. So now let's take a look at the video.
Now let's look at the brain and what happens when we're engaging in short-term or working memory. Here we see that the prefrontal cortex focuses attention on a sensory stimuli and will hold the information long enough for us to solve the problem at hand. Then it will transfer the information to the hippocampus for memory consolidation. We also know that the encoding stage of memory is consolidated through rehearsal and repetition. So if we repeatedly fire the neural impulses that are necessary to convert a short-term memory to a long-term memory, this will occur in the hippocampus. Now the main reason Henry Molaison, or HM, could no longer form long-term memories is because a large part of his hippocampus was removed. But as I said, we know that the hippocampus isn't the only thing that's important for working memory. We also need our prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for our ability to maintain attention and focus. So when you're reading, having a conversation, or looking at a map and trying to figure out directions, it's our prefrontal cortex that allows us to keep this information available. Do you remember earlier in the lesson when we discussed the visuospatial sketchpad and phonological loop? Well, we see that in each of these areas is where brain activity occurs during each of these processes. So we know that auditory input is processed and rehearsed in the phonological loop from the prefrontal cortex to the language comprehension center, which is located to the back and left part of the parietal lobes. We call this language comprehension center the Wernicke's region, after the person who discovered it. You may remember this when we talked about it in lesson 3. As for visual information, in the visuospatial sketchpad, it goes from the prefrontal cortex to the temporal lobes for spatial information, and then to the occipital lobe for visual information. Now we know that our explicit memory storage are stored in the respective cortex and the area that it was originally processed. Now other types of memories, such as implicit memories, are stored in structures of the subcortex, specifically the striatum, amygdala, and cerebellum. So now let's look at the brain and what happens when we're engaging in short-term or working memory. Here we see that the pre-implicit memories are stored in...
Now, I want to call your attention to these various parts of the brain that the video is illustrating to help us understand better, capture a better illustration of how the brain actually works in regards to short-term and long-term memory. Now, you have several parts here. You have the front part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And as you can see, this focuses attention on sensory stimuli, things that you experience that come into your brain for processing. That's the prefrontal cortex. At the top of the brain, as you can see, the phonological loop, this is a very large piece of the brain here. And it's involved primarily with auditory input. From our previous discussions as it relates to stimuli, whether it's auditory or visual, Joseph, can you tell me what is auditory?
Auditory is sounds, that kind of thing.
Right,
So vibration.
auditory is sounds, vibrations, things of that nature. Visual, Oscar, what is visual?
Things you can see.
Visual is things that you can see. Exactly. So from this illustration, you can see that there's two major parts of the brain that processes auditory information as well as visual information. Now, something that's very interesting here, there's a part of the brain called the hippocampus. And it's not that large, as you can see here. One of the things that we have not discussed that I want to bring your attention is a young man by the name of Henry Melancon. They refer to him as HM. And this young man at a very early age suffered extreme seizures. So much so that he just continually had them. And it became it became a point in his life where he couldn't function. It was debilitating. And so it got to a point where he had surgery because the doctors didn't know what else to do. And when he had surgery, they took out a big portion of this hippocampus. So you can see it's not that large anyway. And that affected his memory going forward. And we'll come back to that a little later and discuss more in depth about this person called Henry Melancon, or as he's referred to in psychology circles, HM. But the hippocampus is a very important part of the brain because it deals with memory consolidation. You remember from our last discussion, we talked about some techniques that we could use to improve our memory consolidation, and several of you brought out rehearsal and repetition. Now, I think this is a good point in our discussion where we can transition and kind of recap what we discussed from our last class. In the memory making process, there's three primary stages: encoding, storage, and retrieval. Oscar, give us a brief discussion of encoding.
It's when your memory starts to get a grasp on the action or the idea that you're trying to contain.
Right, so that's where encoding is, where the information or the stimuli is coming in. And if we refer back to our video, the part of the brain that processes that information is called the prefrontal cortex. Storage. Storage is very important. Ms. Now, can you help us out with storage? Remind us what storage means.
Okay, storage is the step after encoding, so it's the information trying to, process, you're trying to retain it technically.
Right. You're trying to retain that information that's been processed in from the very beginning.
That's the rehearsal part.
I'm sorry?
The rehearsal part. Read and rehearse.
Oh, right. So when we have the storage, that when the information comes in, the brain is trying to consolidate that information. And the hippocampus is very important in that process that we just seen. Now, in order for us to then retrieve the information has to be properly encoded, stored, in order for us to retrieve it or to recall it. So we may need, in this step here, from the storage to retrieval process, we may need to do some things that will help us remember that information. This is a better description of what we're talking about. We have the sensory input. This is where the information is coming in. We're beginning at this point to try to develop our memory for remembering the information. We got to be careful here that at this point that the information is not lost. This is where the short-term memory comes in. It's now brought out rehearsal. From this step to this step, from the storage step to the retrieval step, we may need to try to rehearse this information. And we can do that by doing a couple of things. It was brought out in our last class period that one of the techniques that you use is repetition. And I think I shared with you an example that we used in the 3rd grade when I was in math to remember multiplication was repetition. That's how we understood our multiplication table. We repeated it over and over again. And again, we're doing rehearsal so that we won't lose the information. After a period of time, then what we wanted this information through these processes here that we use to help retain the information, we want it to permanently be lodged in our long-term memory. And it's when the information is captured in a long-term memory that we can retrieve it easily and retain it. So let's take a look at our objectives for today. We have only 3. The first objective is to identify the various parts of the brain that are involved in the memory-making process. We want to contrast these different parts of the brain that are involved in the memory-making process. And we also want to summarize some study techniques and some strategies that we're going to utilize from our book and from some other resources that I give you. We want to take a very close look at some of those study strategies so that you'll be able to use these strategies present day and going forward, even in your classes, your remaining classes in high school and through college. So these are the objectives that we're going to be taking a look at today. So at this time, what I would like for you to do, I think everyone is paired up into groups, at least groups of 2. There may be one group that has more than one person in it. So at this time, what I want you to do, I want you to take your notes that you took from the video and from our introduction of the memory-making process, and I want you to discuss the various parts of the brain that are involved in the memory-making process. And we're going to take about 6 to 7 minutes to do this. After you've talked to your partner about the various functions of the brain in the memory-making process, then we're going to report out to the larger group from some of the groups that you're paired in to further our discussion. Now, at this time, are there any questions that you may have pertaining to the video that illustrated some of the brain functions in short-term, long-term memory? Are there any questions that we can address prior to you working in your groups? All right, what questions may you have in regards to the 3 steps of the memory-making process: encoding, storage, and retrieval? Which questions specifically do you have in regards to that process? Are there any? No? All right. So go ahead and work in your groups for that 6 to 7 minutes. I want you to discuss what you recorded as you took notes from the video as it pertains to the various parts of the brain and its functions, their functions in the memory-making process. So discuss those amongst yourselves in your group.
So, I guess the first part of the brain is the part right here. And that's what we're basically using right now.
And if you have any questions, just raise your hand and let me know.
So I guess it sits there until we go Yeah, then there's, so that's the, monologue. That's like the sound of like, that's, I think that's what audio is important here. I guess that's how you remember music.
Let's talk about this. That's what it is. Oh,
Like, I guess, remember color, yeah.
to help you out, I'm going to put the illustration of the video back up on the screen if you need to refer back to it. Some of you may need to, some of you may not, but it's at your disposal.
Working experience,
Like how what we're saying. It's really interesting how it's like kind of right in the center, and it's like I guess it's switching back to like different bits and pieces, and it's kind of crazy. But that one thing is evolved like language comprehension because then like it's not being said to really explain everything, whatever. But it's not noisy.
Okay, you have 2.5 more minutes.
Yeah, so I guess he did that one under the occipital lobe, so that's a great good in the back. That's like you don't want to hit your head in the back because it controls your eyes and vision, right? So that's kind of like we already talked about. You see something, oh, that's this. It's all the way to the back. It is. Chords, I guess, going all the way to the back. It's kind of crazy, Like
Just so y'all working,
but
you chill. Huh?
I guess.
You know that?
Then we have the video check on the camera. But yeah, it's like you have to have all the stuff to actually record information, sounds, voices, faces, like how to write, how you actually
We have about 30 seconds.
Yeah, and then I just wrote down here, you code it first, store it, and then just it's kind of like when you're taking notes, you like write it down, you review it back to yourself or something, and that really helps you like, so
Does anyone still need the video?
remember it,
Does anyone still need the illustration from the video? No?
Structures.
All right, so it's time. So let's have a short discussion. Let's report out to the larger group from your parent groups as it relates to these various parts of the brain and how they function. So let's start with Ms. Moon, your group, you and Oscar. Tell us a little bit about what you learned.
Well, the prefrontal cortex is like important for maintaining and focusing your attention on the sensory stimuli, which means we feel like that's more of like a part of the encoding stage of short-term memory, like working memory, and then like the hippocampus is like the rehearsal and repetition, so that'll be part of like the storage stage.
Okay, very good, excellent. Oscar, you have anything else to add?
Just try to piece everything together to see where everything would fit in the 3 stages.
Okay, all right. Joseph, you and Ms. Niles' group.
Something I think really cool that I learned at least was how the frontal cortex there said this really is the attention part of your brain. It's what holds information. It's how we keep our focus. I thought that was pretty cool. Something else was cool is that the I guess the top part of your cortex, right, is for sound and audio, right, and that was pretty interesting because I thought it was somewhere else.
Okay, Ms. Niles.
I guess something cool for me was chronological loop. Obviously, but it's process never hurts. I guess that's cool. Because I didn't know that at first.
Okay. So, all right, so Joe, let's go back to, repeat if you can for the group what you just said.
About the phonological loop?
Yes.
So, the phonological loop is the top part of the brain, right? And I'm pretty sure that's where you're able to record sound and audio. So, like, if you hear a ringtone or something,
Right.
you can remember it, that kind of thing. Or, microwave, that kind of thing, anything really, And right below that's like how you do language, but that's pretty cool.
And it is, to use your term, it is pretty cool when you think about it with the phonological loop, because with that information being processed, with the information being processed in that part of the brain, right here, as Joseph pointed out and Ms. Niles pointed out, this dealing with auditory input. And right below it is the language comprehension. So when we're talking about auditory, we're talking about sound. We're talking about phonics. This is a big piece of how people learn to speak and pronounce words. So there's a very strong correlation here between this part of the brain and this part of the brain, working this area, as it relates to language, the ability to speak. I think that's fascinating, Ms. Nell. Now, we're going to transition at this point, and we're going to take a look at some study techniques, some study strategies. In your book, on page 160 to 167, these are some study strategies, study techniques that we have been introduced to, but I want us to take a closer look at them today in the time that we have left. Remaining in your guided groups, I want you to review pages 160 to 167, and I want you to pick out and identify a few of these techniques that you have personally used and you have found helpful in regards to you remembering information that you needed to remember for any of your classes. Now, within the book, it talks about several different techniques. And all of these are discussed on pages 160 to 167. So in your guided groups, we're going to take about 7 minutes to do this. I want you to identify the study strategies and techniques that you have used in the past and that you feel have been beneficial to you. But I also want you to be able to explain and discuss these techniques, because we need to be able to understand how they are affecting our learning, as well as being able to recognize them by being a strategy that we can use to benefit us. Now, what questions do you have in regards to the instructions at this point, working in your paired groups and looking at pages 160 to 167, dealing with the study strategies, techniques? What questions do you have? Remember, we're doing two things. We're identifying those techniques and strategies that you have used in the past, you found helpful, but we also need to explain and discuss them in detail as well. If there are not any questions, you have 7 minutes to work in your guided groups at this point. You can continue to use the same worksheet, the same sheet of paper that you've been working off of since this past Wednesday. And we're going to give a couple other groups an opportunity to participate at this time. Yes.
say on the there's like keywords, or it's like the word correction. So like that's how well, actually not the whole word, just like LDR.
Cause you know how I have all these questions,
And then for the
right here,
first, it's like,
I put some of those like reviews of material and questions in mine. And why does this make sense? And then review should
Kind of like the
not have flashcards.
they do usually use flashcards more so for like verification.
But I feel like the best things are review sheets and flashcards.
Yeah, the issue, even after, the fact.
And the teacher usually so it's like they do
We have a lot of students that.
Visually, like, stuff like model brain, to like look at, or just people, who, just to
Well,
like see
the
it.
hippocampus is involved in also storage.
Of course, also.
The prefrontal cortex is the one in the front that helps with input of information.
I like it that have it,
Axis of rotation.
especially with like, some stuff that are
Like videos on television rotate, visualizing that I can fully understand the wording to what actually means. I guess overall just like reduce stress.
like all of this, these kids, all these classes,
Exercise,
memory,
yeah.
fun ones are the ones that like, do something right.
Does anyone have any specific questions in reviewing the material, pages 160, 167, that you may need assistance with at this time? All right, you have about 2 more minutes. And I think what we'll do, that will be a good utilization of our time in the remaining 12 minutes that we have, is I'm gonna call on one group, I'm gonna call on the remaining groups to report out at least one of these study strategies. If there's a study strategy that was already called prior to me calling on your group, that you was thinking about discussing, just select a different strategy. I think there's plenty enough strategies there within the pages of the resources that you're given for us not to necessarily have duplication. But if we do, that's fine, we'll deal with that at that time. All right, these are very close.
what you would do is, say, for Mercury, you'll say, my very excellent mother. Mother would represent Mercury. Just would represent Jupiter. Serve would represent Saturn. So it's a similar concept, but the difference is, with this particular technique, you're using these letters and putting in a sentence, using different words that represent what you're trying to read. So, with this one,
Does anyone need any more time? All right, excellent. All right, Ms. Cornish, your group.
Yes.
Identify one of the study techniques that you used in the past. Tell us why you used it and tell us a little bit about it.
Well, one of the study techniques that I personally used in the past is like a variation of mind maps. Like I
Mind maps?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah, I use both like the visual, like actual mapping it out for studying for my learner's permit test.
Okay.
So I whenever I read the chapters, I use this chapter and here are the main points. But I also use a variation of it with the outline method, where I have some symbols and I indent certain lines to take notes in classes, especially for my U.S. history class.
All right. So you're actually using a combination. You're using mind maps. Now, remind us what mind maps are.
Basically, it's just bubbles that lead to other bubbles, and they have ideas connected around them.
Exactly. With a mind map, you have a main idea. And from this main idea, you have subsequent information that pertains to this main idea that helps you remember or keep focus of this main idea in regards to what you're studying.